She should have been dead, blue-lipped, brittle frozen, wrapped in fox pelts beneath a sky that threatened to bury them both in snow. He dragged her from death's edge with nothing but fire, flint, and stubborn mercy. But when her eyes opened, so did a truth colder than the mountain wind. She wasn't lost. She was returning. Returning to claim what was hers, land he'd bled for, built on, believed was his. And in that moment, the man who saved her realized he might have just rescued the end of everything he called home. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The blizzard hit just after dusk, swallowing the sun in a curtain of white so thick it erased the trail behind Silas Kane like it never existed. Wind howled like wounded beasts across the ridgelines, snow curling through the black pines in ghostly spirals, and each step forward was a battle against nature's quiet, suffocating wrath. Silas, a man built of sinew, shadow, and solitude, trudged on through the biting gale, his beard ice-stiff, his rifle slung low, boots breaking through drifts that reached his thighs. He wasn't looking for anyone. He never did. But when his boot struck something beneath a bent pine, something that didn't groan like a branch or give like snow, instinct stilled him. He crouched low and brushed frost from a mound cloaked in white and fur. A hand appeared pale, gloveless, and unmoving. A woman lay curled in on herself, half buried, her face rimed in ice, her lips blue, lashes frozen shut. The fur coat wrapped around her was fox, rich and stitched with the kind of care that didn't belong to mountain life. Her breath was shallow, barely there, but it was breath nonetheless. Silas acted without thought. He slung her over his shoulder, his muscles screaming from the weight, and staggered through the storm, retracing paths only he knew, until the lantern light of his trapper's shack blinked faintly in the distance like a dying star. Inside, he kicked the door shut, dropped to his knees beside the hearth, and brought her body close to the coals, stripping off her wet layers with steady hands, wrapping her in blankets and heat. He spoke no words. Not to her, not to himself. He just stoked the fire higher, letting it hiss and crackle as warmth bled slowly into her skin. Her face narrow, proud, streaked with frostbite, stayed slack through the long hours. He fed her broth with a spoon made of bone, fingers trembling not from cold but from memories he couldn't shake. He'd seen too many frozen bodies in these mountains. Buried too, many. The wind screamed against the logs, trying to claw its way in, and Silas stared at the shadows, watching the flames paint her face in flickers of life and death. Somewhere in the deepest stretch of night, she stirred. A twitch of her fingers, a cough rasped from her throat like gravel breaking loose. Then her eyes opened, not wide, not with panic or confusion, but slow, like someone waking not from sleep, but from a long, calculated rest. And those eyes, sharp, wintry gray, locked on Silas with the unsettling calm of someone who knew exactly where she was and exactly why she'd survived. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, just watched him with a gaze that held no gratitude, no fear, only weight. And in that moment, Silas felt something shift not in the room, but in the marrow of his bones. He had pulled her back from the brink, but she didn't look like someone saved. She looked like someone returned from something worse than death, and whatever she'd come back to. Silas knew this storm was only the beginning. By the time morning came, the storm had crawled back into the peaks, leaving behind a glassy world of white silence and aching cold. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned low and steady, and the woman, her skin flushed now with returning life, sat upright against a wall, watching Silas Kane with an unsettling stillness, as if she had been awake long before she let him know it. She'd eaten little, spoken less, eyes tracking the room like a surveyor measuring lines unseen. Silas moved around her with the caution of a man who'd once shared space with wolves and learned they don't always bare teeth when they mean to kill. The silence between them stretched thick until the second day, when she finally broke it, not with thanks or question, but with a name. "I'm Evelyn Langford." The sound of it struck the room like a rifle shot. Silas froze, the ladle in his hand hovering midair, every tendon in his arm going rigid. That name carried weight, not just in dollars or titles, but in blood. Langford, the name that had split the valley down its heart a decade ago. The name that sent men with ink-stained contracts and hired rifles to claim mountains as if they were blank pages waiting for signatures. Silas's own brother, Jacob, had died during the skirmishes trying to stop Langford men from burning homesteads to ash. Memories surged uninvited. The stench of smoke, children crying in the timberline, a cabin collapsing in fire, and now the daughter of that empire sat in his home, wrapped in his coat, drinking his broth. He stared at her, not speaking, not blinking, as if her mere presence might summon ghosts. Evelyn met his gaze with neither guilt nor apology, only quiet resolve. "You know the name," she said, her voice hoarse but clean-edged, like frost-biting skin. "Then you know I'm not here by accident." Silas didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was its own kind of thunder. She nodded once, as if accepting terms of a truce no one had offered. "I'm not here to make peace," she said plainly. "I'm here because this land belongs to me now." The brazenness of it, spoken so flatly, so certain, nearly made Silas laugh. But it wasn't amusement that twisted his lip, it was the cold rage of a man who'd bled for ground someone else thought they could buy. He rose slow from his chair, towering over her, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "That land was never for sale," he muttered. Evelyn didn't flinch. "It was taken, and now it's been reclaimed." Her words, spoken like law, like prophecy, sat heavy between them. For Silas, it wasn't just about dirt and trees, it was memory, survival, the graves buried beneath the snow. For Evelyn, it was legacy, leverage, a return to something promised. She didn't beg for warmth. She didn't ask for a favor. She had walked through death's mouth and emerged not humbled, but sharpened. Silas didn't know if she'd come to make war or build something different, but one truth became clear. The woman he saved wasn't a stranger lost in the storm. She was a storm of her own, and she had come home. The storm had passed, but the world remained locked in ice, the passes buried, trails erased, and the cold holding fast like a second skin. Days passed inside the small cabin like hours stretched too thin, each breath shared beneath the low timber beams adding weight to the already charged air. Silas Kane, a man carved out of solitude and silence, found himself constantly aware of her Evelyn Langford moving through his space like she belonged, though she never acted like she did. He tended to her frostbitten fingers with hands calloused from trap lines and winters too long, saying nothing as he smeared balm on blackened knuckles, wrapping them with the same care he'd give a wounded hawk. She didn't thank him, didn't wince, just watched him with the same steely patience she gave everything his food, his fire, his weapons. She was healing, and he could see it, not just in the color returning to her cheeks, but in the quiet strength building in her posture. She wasn't drifting toward recovery, she was reclaiming it, piece by piece. He noticed how she studied the trees through the frost-ringed window, how she marked wind shifts and listened to the wolves without fear, her gaze fixed not with awe, but calculation. At night, she sat by the hearth sharpening one of his knives, the steady scrape of metal on stone like a drumbeat reminding him she was no ordinary woman from the East. She didn't ask questions, didn't try to barter for kindness. And when she found the hand-drawn maps rolled and tucked behind the stove, she didn't hesitate to spread them out across the table, her eyes scanning the peaks and rivers like a returning commander reviewing lost territory. Silas had made those maps himself, over years of hard living, every trail tested, every ridge bled for. He meant them to be private, sacred. Yet there she was, tracing the lines with her good hand, pausing at notches he thought only he knew, murmuring names of places never printed in any ledger. "This one," she said quietly, tapping a curve in the river near the Twin Pines. "Langford men died here, didn't they?" Silas didn't answer, but his silence roared loud in the close space. She already knew. Her knowledge wasn't the kind learned from books or passed through courtrooms, it was inherited, soaked through family lore and blood deals. And still, she didn't flinch or retreat. She kept studying. He tried to ignore the coil of unease tightening in his gut, the realization that she knew this land almost as well as he did. Not as a trapper, but as a strategist. Not for survival, but for control. It made him wonder, had she truly collapsed in the snow by chance? Or had she come too far, too fast, driven by the same hunger he now saw flickering behind her cold eyes? She was waiting for something, watching the snowpack, measuring the melt. And all the while, Silas felt the walls closing in, not from the cold, but from the invisible lines she was redrawing in her mind. He'd thought of her as injured, as rescued, as human. But now he saw the shape of something more dangerous. A woman who had crossed the boundary between helplessness and purpose, and who had no intention of going back. The thaw came slow, not with sunshine but with a steady drip of melting ice from the cabin's eaves and the groan of snow shifting off the roof in thick, wet slabs. The wind lost its bite, and the sky softened from iron gray to a dull, reluctant blue. On the fifth morning, Evelyn Langford rose without assistance, her movements stiff but resolute, as if the pain in her limbs was merely a cost already paid. She dressed deliberately layer by layer, fingers still clumsy from frostbite, but unshaken. Silas watched her from the corner of the room, a blade he'd been honing still in hand, though he hadn't touched it in minutes. Her satchel, untouched since the day she collapsed in the snow, now sat open on the table. She reached into it with a familiarity that told him this moment wasn't spontaneous, it was always planned. She withdrew a leather folio, the edges worn but the contents pristine. Slowly, deliberately, she unfolded the parchment and slid it across the table. The firelight caught the wax seal first red and deep with the impression of some official crest, then the ink, bold and black, signatures etched like brands. Court of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Silas read it once. Then again. The words stayed the same. The land his land. The ridges and trails he knew like veins in his own hand. The streams where he trapped mink. The birch grove where he buried his dog. The slope he nearly died on during the hard winter, all of it, from the eastern river bend to the rocky crag that kissed the clouds, was legally owned now by Evelyn Langford. It wasn't stolen with guns this time. It was purchased with inheritance. Acquired through lawsuits filed and fought while Silas lived in a world without ink. She didn't gloat. She didn't explain. She simply said, "It's done." But the lack of venom made it worse. There was no battle to rage against, no rifles to fire, just a cold, binding truth signed in courtrooms hundreds of miles away. Silas's hands curled into fists around the map he'd left on the table, his knuckles whitening as he fought the instinct to rip that paper into ash. "This land," he began, but the words withered in his throat. He looked at her then not as a woman he'd saved, but as a force he couldn't stop. She didn't back down under his stare. "It belonged to my family before it was ever yours," she said. Not cruelly, just plainly, like history spoken through law. "And I've come to take what was promised." Promised. The word echoed in his skull. No one had promised him anything. Everything he had here, he'd carved, earned, defended. There were no grants for men like Silas, just survival, one frozen winter at a time. He rose from his chair with the slow tension of a coiled bear, his voice low and dangerous. "That deed's paper. This land. It's blood." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "Then maybe we're both entitled." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of something broken, not yet shattered, but splintered beyond repair. The parchment sat between them like a loaded pistol neither had drawn yet. And in that breathless standoff, Silas understood what she was. Not a thief, not a victim, but a reckoning. One written in ink where his life had been written in scars. The night after she laid the deed on the table, the fire crackled low, its light dancing across the cabin walls like ghosts unwilling to settle. Silas sat hunched in the corner, boots planted firm on the wooden floor, staring into the flames as if they held answers he'd buried long ago. Evelyn, silent, occupied the far side of the room, eyes on the same fire but seeing something else entirely. Neither spoke for a long time, until Silas finally broke the stillness with a voice hollowed by old wounds. 10 years ago, your father's men came through here with stakes and guns," he said, his words slow, like a man carving memories into wood. They rode in like they owned the Sunday, didn't matter who lived on the land, homesteaders, trappers, whole families. Langford deeds said we were trespassing. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, the firelight sharpening the lines on his weathered face. "They burned the Bennetts out of their home with the kids still inside. I pulled them out myself, lungs full of smoke. Watched a man die with his arms around his grain stores, trying to protect what little he had. But it wasn't just fire and threats. It was method. Mark the land, post the guards, bleed it dry." Evelyn said nothing, But her breath slowed, and her gaze didn't waver. My brother Jacob thought we could reason with them, Silas continued, the name catching in his throat like splinters. He walked up to those bastards unarmed, holding nothing but a deed scribbled on buckskin and signed by the hands who built this valley with their backs. They shot him through the chest. Said it was a misunderstanding. The words hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. After that, we fought. We fought because we had nothing else left. And when your father realized there'd be more blood than profit, he pulled back. Left this land scorched and bitter. But he didn't forget. He sent men to whisper claims back east, gather ink instead of bullets. He looked over at Evelyn, the weight of years pressing behind his eyes. Now you sit here with your fancy paper and your clean hands, talking about promises and legacies like we ain't still nursing scars that never healed. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but she didn't. Instead, she held his gaze, and for the first time, Silas saw something in her that unsettled him more than guilt resolve, the kind that didn't beg for forgiveness or recoil from blame. I was 16 when that happened, she said, her voice low, flat. I remember the silence in our house when the letters came back. I remember the smell of ash on my father's coat and how no one talked about what happened in the valley. It became a shadow, something we inherited but weren't allowed to touch. She drew a long breath, as if weighing every word. I didn't order those men. I didn't burn your cabin, but I carry the weight of it anyway. Her hand rested lightly on the deed beside her. I came not to erase the past, but to face it, and to claim what I've bled for in other ways. Silas narrowed his eyes, bitterness flaring. You ever lost blood for this land? Evelyn's reply came cold and sharp. I nearly froze to death coming back to it. And with that, the fire snapped loud, the log collapsing inward, showering sparks like a warning neither of them could ignore. It started with hoofprints, fresh ones stamped deep into the thawing earth along the eastern ridge. Too many for a hunter, too orderly for cattlemen. Silas spotted them on a morning patrol, his breath misting in the cold as he crouched by the tracks, his jaw tightening with the slow, creeping certainty of change. By sundown, there were more signs. Cut trees stacked along the riverside, strange flags planted in the soil, and a man's cough carried faintly on the wind when no one should have been within 10 miles. That night, while Evelyn penciled meticulous notes into a ledger by the fire, Silas stood in the doorway with his rifle slung loose and quiet rage simmering just beneath his breath. We've got company, he muttered, and she didn't ask who they both knew. The wolves had come. Not the four-legged kind, but men in stiff coats and polished boots, men who rode with maps and contracts tucked in their saddlebags beside revolvers. Within days, the valley's solitude fractured. He saw surveyor stakes driven into the earth like spears, and tents rising near the river bend, their canvas bellies glowing with lamplight. The Langford Creston embossed L, inside a triangle marked crates of supplies like a brand across the land itself. Silas stormed back to the cabin, boots mud-crusted, teeth clenched. You brought them, he growled. Evelyn looked up from her writing, her expression unreadable. They were always coming, she replied, with or without me. But her calm didn't cool the fire in his chest. You used me, he spat. I dragged you from death, gave you food, warmth, and all the while, you were waiting for them to roll in behind you. Evelyn closed the ledger slowly, not defensive, but deliberate. You think saving my life gave you control over it? She asked. This isn't a conquest, Silas. It's inevitability. The words chilled him more than the blizzard ever had. She hadn't come to settle or steal, she'd come to stage. A forward post disguised as desperation, a spearhead of something larger and colder than her alone. The valley, which once whispered with wind and memory, now buzzed with tension and purpose, as if it knew it was being carved up in absent boardrooms. Silas watched the newcomers ride through, some nodding to him like neighbors, others not even bothering to hide their disdain. He wasn't just being edged out, he was being written over. The land beneath his boots, the trees that had watched him bury kin, now had numbers and boundaries sketched on maps miles away. The realization hit like a rifle butt to the gut. This wasn't a dispute between a man and a woman, it was a campaign. Evelyn, though colder than the frostbite that nearly claimed her, wasn't the end. She was the beginning. And worse, Silas saw now that she wasn't trying to deceive him, she simply didn't need to. Because the papers were signed, the wheels were turning, and the mountain no longer belonged to the people who bled for it. It belonged to signatures and suits. In the forest that night, Silas heard the real wolves howling at the tree line, but their voices were outnumbered now by the clatter of hammers, the metallic grind of progress, and the laughter of men who thought themselves kings because someone handed them a deed. And as he stood in the dark, rifle in hand, watching flickers of firelight rise from strange camps in the distance, Silas understood the bitter truth: he hadn't saved her from the cold. He had escorted it in. The air in the cabin had grown heavy, not with smoke, but with the weight of unspoken truths piling higher with each passing day, until the tension finally snapped like dry kindling in the hearth. It was late moonlight bleeding through the window slats, the fire burning low, casting long, restless shadows. Silas stood by the doorway, jaw clenched, arms folded, watching Evelyn as she scribbled once more into her ledger, her posture composed but taut. "You knew who I was," he said at last, the words sharp, low, final. She didn't look up. "From the moment you heard my name, you knew, and still you let this all play out like some game." Her pen stilled. Silence expanded like smoke between them. "You think I planned to freeze?" She replied coolly. "That I threw myself into a storm just to con a trapper with a bad shoulder and a buried past?" Silas stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "You didn't have to say a word when I dragged you in. You could have stayed quiet, taken your time. But you waited until your men were close enough to smell the river trail. That's not desperation. That's strategy." Evelyn rose then, slow and steady, her eyes hard and clear. "I could have left you to rot in that snow after you patched me up. I recognized your name, Cain, Jacob's brother, the one who lit the fires at Devil's Hollow. My father called you a ghost in his reports, a man too stubborn to die. And yet, I stayed. I stayed knowing exactly who you were. Ask yourself why." Her voice wasn't pleading, it was cutting, precise. Silas's breath caught for a moment, not from guilt, but the echo of a name he hadn't heard aloud in years. Jacob. It hit him like ice water down the spine, and his fury splintered, not extinguished, but fractured by something else. "You think that means something?" he muttered, pacing now. "You think that makes us even?" She shook her head. "There is no even. Not between your fire and my ink. We've both done what we had to do, and now we're here." They stared at each other across the fire, each one bearing the armor of the past, but with cracks just wide enough for old pain to shine through. No tears, no apologies. Just two souls weathered by different wars, forced into the same room by fate's cruel design. The fire popped suddenly, casting a burst of light that danced across Evelyn's face, revealing not just resolve but weariness. Real, deep-down fatigue that mirrored the heaviness in Silas's own bones. Slowly, he eased down into the chair opposite her. She sat too, not quite facing him, but no longer turned away. For the first time, the quiet between them wasn't a threat, but a strange sort of truce. Not peace, but pause. "You ever think about what it cost?" Silas asked after a long while, voice low, almost a whisper. "All this land, all this fighting, what it cost us?" Evelyn didn't respond right away. Then she said, barely audible, "Every day." The fire crackled on, the logs collapsing inward, throwing sparks into the chimney as the night held them both in its quiet grip. Not enemies, not allies, just two names in a ledger of losses, sharing a flame they didn't light but couldn't put out. They came at dawn, three riders cutting across the frosted ridge with the quiet confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable, their silhouettes long and sharp against the rising Sunday. Silas spotted them from the tree line, rifle in hand, instincts prickling like a warning from the earth itself. These weren't miners or surveyors, these were hired hands, the kind paid not to ask questions, only to enforce answers already written in ink and threat. When they dismounted in front of the cabin, their spurs clinked against the hard ground like nails in a coffin lid. One of them, a broad man with a Langford insignia stitched into his coat lapel, called out, voice flat and practiced, "Cain, you've got 24 hours to clear out. This land's under Langford claim now, and the family's got no patience left for squatters." Silas stepped out, Rifle lowered but firm in his grip, jaw tight, blood simmering just beneath the surface. Before he could speak, Evelyn appeared in the doorway behind him, her face pale but eyes blazing with something dangerous. "Stand down," she said coldly, stepping past Silas and into the snow. The lead rider smirked. "Didn't come for you, Miss Langford. Orders come from higher than you now. Your uncle says this claim ain't yours to enforce. You were supposed to scout and step aside." Silence fell like a guillotine between them. Evelyn's voice dropped, low and sharp as a knife. "Tell my uncle this land's already mine. The deed's legal. The ink is dry. And if he wants to dispute it, he can ride up here himself instead of sending dogs." The man's face tightened. "This is family business." "Then it's rotten blood," she snapped back. And in that moment, everything Silas thought he knew twisted sideways. She wasn't here to build on her father's empire, she was here to dismantle it. Not for gold or power, but for something deeper, more personal. She turned to him, her breath misting in the cold, voice lower now. "I inherited the claim after my father died. My uncle tried to challenge it in court and failed, so now he sends men like these to scare me off. He wants the land back because it threatens his reach, because if I hold it, it breaks the monopoly." Silas said nothing, just studied her, seeing now what he'd missed beneath all her steel. Defiance, not against him, but against a legacy. She wasn't just a Langford, she was the fracture in their foundation. The lead rider reached for his holster, not fast, but fast enough to trigger instinct. Silas raised his rifle, finger brushing the trigger, and time slowed like snowfall. Evelyn didn't flinch. She stepped between them. "Don't," she warned. "You fire on me, and you start a war you can't contain." The man hesitated, hand hovering, then finally pulled back, spitting into the snow. "This ain't over," he growled. "It is for you," she answered, eyes never leaving his. They mounted up and rode off, their retreat as quiet as their arrival. But the message was clear: Evelyn's claim wasn't protected by family loyalty, but by sheer force of will. As the hoofbeats faded, Silas turned to her, uncertain but no longer blind. "You're burning the bridge behind you," he said. Evelyn nodded. It was never mine to cross. And just like that, the war shifted. She wasn't just the storm anymore. She was lightning cutting clean through the name she carried. It began before sunrise, as shadows still clung to the trees and frost glazed the ground in a silent sheen. Silas awoke to the distant, unmistakable crunch of hooves over hard snow, too many for a scouting party, too steady for merchants or settlers. He was already loading his rifle before Evelyn appeared beside him, face grim, revolver already holstered at her hip. "They're here to finish it," she said, no question in her voice. Just fact. Through the cracks in the cabin wall, they saw the first line of riders, 6 men, all armed, faces wrapped against the cold but eyes sharp with intent. Langford's hired guns, come not to negotiate, but to erase. The first shot cracked the stillness like a whip, splintering the porch post inches from Silas's head. He fired back instinctively, dropping to one knee, and the cabin erupted into chaos. Bullets tore through the walls, shattered glass, bit into beams. Smoke curled fast, thick and acrid, filling their lungs with heat and grit. Evelyn ducked behind the hearth, returning fire with sharp precision, each shot deliberate. She moved like someone trained not in battlefields, but in consequences, quick, quiet, certain. Silas fought like the land itself, raw, unyielding, every shot an answer to a decade of silence. One man rushed the cabin from the side, bootsteps crunching heavy and fast. Silas turned just in time to see the glint of steel at the window. Before he could react, a crack split the air and Evelyn's pistol roared her bullet, catching the man in the neck, sending him flailing backward into the snow. She saved him, no time to speak it. Another round punched through the front wall and caught Silas in the shoulder, spinning him backward into the table, pain lighting up his chest like fire through dry brush. He gritted his teeth, blood already soaking his shirt, and waved her toward the rear. "Go," he rasped, pushing himself up. She didn't hesitate, didn't argue, but before disappearing through the back door, she dropped a second revolver beside him. "Don't die here," she ordered. Then she vanished into the smoke. Silas dragged himself to the window, propped his rifle, and waited. When 2 more men crept through the clearing, he took them down with the last of his strength, the recoil jarring his wound so hard he nearly blacked out. Then silence. No more shots. Just the whine of wind curling through broken wood, and the slow hiss of snow falling onto spilled oil and blood. He lay there, breath shallow, staring up at the ceiling beams, wondering if this would be his final sunrise. Then the door creaked open, and Evelyn stepped in, bruised, face streaked with ash, her coat torn but eyes alive. She knelt beside him without a word, pressed her hand to the wound, and for the first time, there was no fire between them, only warmth. Not mercy, not debt, just survival, shared. Outside, the snow had turned red in places, the color stark against the white, already beginning to fade as the cold took it back. They sat there together, the world quiet once more. And Silas realized the war was no longer about who owned the land, but who was willing to bleed for it. And of everyone who'd come with guns and claims and orders, only 2 were left standing. By the time the last of the snow receded into the thirsty earth and the river began to run fat and loud with meltwater, the valley had changed not in shape, but in spirit. The carcasses of old violence were buried beneath moss and soil, gunshot holes patched, blood washed away by rain and time, though the memory of it all remained, etched into bark, into bones, into breath. Silas's shoulder healed slower than expected, but he wore the sling like a badge, a quiet reminder that pain, endured with purpose, could carve out something lasting. Evelyn, meanwhile, no longer moved like an outsider. She walked the ridgelines at dawn, marked trap trails with ash and stone, planted seeds in thawed earth with fingers once manicured, now calloused. One morning, without ceremony, she took the deed, the parchment that had started the storm, and held it over the hearth's flame. It caught with a hiss, curled in on itself, and vanished into smoke, its ashes joining the dust of countless forgotten claims. Silas watched, saying nothing, because he understood this was no surrender. It was a reckoning, a choice not to erase the past, but to stop dragging it forward. They never called it partnership, never used the word trust, but they shared the work, the land, the silence between breaths. When fences needed mending, they mended them. When a fox raided the chicken coop, Evelyn laid the trap, and Silas skinned the pelt. They rebuilt the cabin, not as a fortress, but as a hearthstone, 2 rooms, a shared table, no lock on the door. And when miners passed through, or surveyors came asking questions, they were met with the same reply: this land's already spoken for. No one dared test the answer. The Langford name held less sway now, whittled down by scandal and failure back east. Evelyn had broken it not with bullets, but with refusal. Silas never asked her why she stayed, and she never asked him why he let her. Some truths didn't need words. They spoke in the way. They moved through the land like it owed them nothing, and they owed it everything. She claimed no title. He claimed no victory. Instead, they planted new trees where bullets had once split trunks, built a smokehouse where the gunfight ended, let the scars of the valley breathe. Spring gave way to summer, and in its warmth, the land bloomed, not tamed, but tended. Not owned, but understood. One evening, as they sat beside the creek with their boots off and feet in the water, Silas broke the quiet. "Funny, ain't it?" he said. "You came here to take this land from me, and ended up giving it back." Evelyn smiled faintly, the lines around her eyes softening. "Maybe neither of us ever owned it. Maybe we just found a way to belong to it." The creek kept talking in its endless voice, and the sky turned amber above them. The sun setting slow over a place that had once been a battleground, and now perhaps was something closer to sacred. And somewhere, carried on wind and water and the hush of pine, a question lingered like smoke from an old fire. Asterisk. What's worth more, land by paper, or land by blood? Asterisk.